Welcome, everyone around the world joining us today to the webinar on safeguarding the fish that eat other fish. My name is Camille Derricks. I'm the Program Development Director in the Marine Stewardship Council. I will be moderating the webinar today. Thanks for joining us, Sad. We have a really broad audience from a lot of different stakeholder groups around the world. We hold this webinar as the Marine Stewardship Council to mark the occasion of the publication of a new small pelagics briefing, which sets out the challenges and the opportunities for the small pelagic fishing industry. Some of you on the call may have seen the tuna handbook that we released on a number of occasions already. This is a very alike publication for small pelagic fisheries, which really aims to inform a broad audience about the status of this industry and aims to help to move the needle on sustainability forward. We have an interesting agenda ahead in the coming hour. I will first give you a context, a summary of the small pelagic briefing that we published today. After that, we will have a panel discussion. And if time permits, we will then go over to questions from the audience. I'm well aware that we actually have received a number of questions from many of you in advance. Some of those questions will be answered in the coming hour, I hope. Some of those questions may not be answered, but in that case, we will get back to you. And by all means, if you haven't received an answer from us, then don't hesitate to reach out. Maybe one important thing to mention is the booklet is actually a digital publication. It's a PDF format. Everyone participating will receive this, so you'll get it in your inbox. You can also download it from the MSC website, or you will be able to contact your local office for a local language version, if you like. I will actually share my screen now, so I can start off my presentation. Bear with me. It should start coming. I'll wait a few seconds for the system to synchronize. I hope you can all see it now. Before diving into my context setting, a warm welcome to the panelists. I will introduce you or give you the opportunity to introduce yourselves more later, but very quickly for the audience, we have with us Helena Delgado Nordman, Responsible Sourcing Manager from Tesco. Thank you for joining us, Helena. Lindsay Pollock from Cargill Aqua Nutrition, Sustainability Manager there. Also, a warm welcome to you, Lindsay. And last but not least, Ian Carr, Business Development Director at Marine Ingredients Producer Vera Maris. Welcome, Ian. Each of you will have the opportunity to introduce yourself in a bit more detail, but first I would like to set the context. So, let me start off with an overview of production and consumption, where the FAO estimates that 179 million tons of fish was produced last year. About 54% of that came from wild capture fisheries, leaving 46% from aquaculture operations. Out of the wild capture landings, 28% was small pelagic, and out of the wild capture production, about 19% was reduced into fish meal and fish oil, mostly coming from small pelagic species. The value of that market for fish meal is about $5 billion, and $2 billion was fish oil production. Now, these numbers are quite staggering, to be honest. If you look at that 19% of wild capture production being reduced, and you look at the 28% coming from small pelagics, that leaves 9% of small pelagics for human consumption. The direct human consumption of small pelagic species is in itself already very big, 9% of wild capture landings, which is more than all tuna, which is more than all whitefish. And that is still dwarfed by that 19% of global production being reduced, mostly coming from small pelagics. I'm saying this because it indicates how important small pelagic fisheries are. They may not be as mediagenic as their bigger cousins like tuna or sharks or maybe the iconic cod, but the small pelagic fisheries of our oceans are really the unsung heroes. This is also why it's extremely important to ensure sustainability for these small pelagic resources. They are, like many other stocks and species, subject to overfishing and ecosystem impact. The FAO estimates some 34% of stocks being in an overfished state, and many small pelagic stocks have a similar challenge to deal with. I'll come back to that in a lot more detail. Climate change is obviously an increasingly big factor, and small pelagic fisheries are having the impacts there. Again, I'll come back to this in a bit more detail later on in this context presentation. And then what is a really big driver of pressure for the small pelagic fisheries is a surge in demand for farmed fish. If you look at the growth of aquaculture over the last 40 years, you see it's an incredibly steep yellow line upwards. Every year, 7 to 8% growth. It's the fastest growing food production sector in the world. And the FAO estimates that that continued. That growth to 2030, as you can see in the dotted yellow line, is predicting that aquaculture will far outstrip the capture fisheries for human consumption by 2030. And these fish that grow in aquaculture facilities, they need to eat. And usually the fish eat feeds where fish meal and fish oil is an important component. These donut charts, they show where the fish meal and fish oil that is originating mostly from wild capture species is going to. The majority, some 75% of fish meal is going to aquaculture operations nowadays, with smaller proportions going to chicken and pig feeds. And with fish oil, it's almost the same, 75% roughly of the fish oil goes into the aquaculture operations, feeds, and a smaller proportion goes to human consumption or other uses. Now, with aquaculture being a big driver, and knowing that overfishing is really a major threat for small pelagic fisheries, I wanted to zoom in a little bit on that. Overfishing is not new. We've seen on many small pelagic fisheries in the past that stocks have crashed, and that in certain cases, moratoria of 15, 20 years were necessary to allow stock recovery. As of recent, we have seen some of the most important small pelagic stocks in the oceans, mackerel, herring, and blue whiting in the Northeast Atlantic, become subject to overfishing. These stocks are essentially subject to higher fishing pressure than what scientists recommend. So the fisheries take 30, 35% more than what is considered to be sustainable in the long run. Obviously, overfishing has an incredible cost. Not only erodes the future production potential of these stocks, it is also creating additional risk for the ecosystem. And in the context of the ecosystem impact caused by climate change, the lower resilience levels caused by overfishing are a real source of concern. I think I'd leave it there because we all know how strong the impacts of overfishing are. And I don't want to just sound only negative, because there are a lot of good signs there too. Sustainable fisheries management works. Management based on science, with harvest control rules and harvest strategies determining how much fish can be caught, has been effective. We've seen that recently with Chilean jack mackerel, where after overfishing, a new regime was installed and the stock recovered, is more productive, and the Chilean industry and also European vessels operating in those waters are certified. Another example comes closer to home, closer to my home in Europe, in the Bay of Biscay between France and Spain. Only 10 years ago, the anchovy stock was overfished. It was in a very fragile state, and the EU had to close the fishery, installed a science-based recovery plan and a harvest strategy that led to recovery, and small-scale fishing operations are now enjoying certification. There's plenty of others that set good examples, from Antarctic krill fisheries to Gulf menhaden fisheries to fisheries for North Sea herring. I will come back to that when I speak a bit more about the uptake of the MSC program by small pelagic fisheries. The big driver here of these improvements, we believe, comes from the markets. Sourcing commitments from retailers, from feed companies, have been a really big incentive for improved fisheries management. Ultimately driving the right type of signals to the stewards, which are the management agencies. They set the boundaries under which fisheries operate, but the market signal has been instrumental in driving those changes. Climate change then. The impact of climate change, as I mentioned, is increasingly big. It's already scarily present. We've seen coral bleaching events because of too warm waters decimating local ecosystems in the tropics. We know ocean acidification is impacting on the exoskeletons of marine creatures and also on the eggs of fish that may impact on reproductive capacity of stocks. And small pelagics are subject to that pressure as well. But that's not all. Warming waters and the natural tolerance levels of species to thrive in certain conditions shows that there will be a move from the tropical regions towards the poles, and that reduces abundance typically in tropical waters, making people that are already typically struggling in terms of food security in the developing world even more struggling. And the fish move towards the poles, where that is potentially allowing higher fish stocks to develop in the near term, but in the long run, there's more uncertainty. The IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, last year released a report on the oceans and the cryosphere and the changing climate. It specifically reflected on this problem of the shifting fish stocks and the impact on abundance. And modeling from Environmental Defense Fund together with the University in California in Santa Barbara has shown that dependent on how much warming will occur, more shifting of stocks will occur. And the warmer it gets, the more stocks will shift out of their traditional zones. Between 30 to 80% of the stocks for which we have data is believed to start moving into new exclusive economic zones. And that destabilizes existing fisheries management and it drives additional complexity. The macro case was specifically mentioned in this IPCC report as a signal of that. And this is why we need to take extra care. With small pelagic species being so important in the oceans, we really need to look at these fisheries when we look and talk about sustainability from an ecosystem perspective. It is exactly why the MSC standard requires the trophic level and the role of fisheries in the ecosystem to be considered when they are assessed against the standard, specifically for low trophic level species, those species that sit low in the food chain, like small pelagic species. The MSC sets higher thresholds in terms of the amount of fish that needs to remain in the water to feed other animals, larger fish, predatory fish, but also marine mammals, birds, and so forth. The default threshold the MSC standard uses is that 75% of virgin biomass or key low trophic level needs to remain in the water, and accordingly, a lower fishing exploitation as well, allowing for that situation to continue. That brings me to my final slide, where I sort of report back on what is driving positive change in the water and the role of the MSC. Clearly, the standard has been increasingly used to drive improvements. Today, 56 small pelagic fisheries are engaged in the program, certified or in full assessment, and some of them are suspended. They catch about 5 million tons collectively, and that represents just under 20% of the global catch of small pelagics. It is a wide range of fisheries here, very large industrialized fisheries, but also small-scale operations that, as I said, have made a lot of improvements to maintain certified, but also when they aspire to get certified, a lot of improvements have been made too. We don't record that as the MSC, but in the FIPS that aspire to become certified, improvements are made. And we're excited that more small pelagic fisheries have indicated in their public FIPS to seek MSC certification when they are in a position to do so. To wrap up, I want to say that the key driver in our view of this successful uptake and that has been the market signal. We need strong commitments from retailers, from brands, from feed companies to support the fishing industry in making this sustainability journey. Hot off the press and very good news, therefore, is that the ASC governance approved the new feed standard. Last week, I was told that ASC feed standard will become used in a series of pilots this spring. And with that standard having MSC as the end objective for marine raw materials used in responsible aquaculture feeds, we hope that will drive additional incentives for improvement of sustainability of the small pelagic fisheries. All of this you can find in the Small Pelagic publication. I said you will get that. And now, having said all this, I actually like to go over to the panel conversation. Before doing so, we have a poll for you. So you should see that pop up on your screen. And I pause a moment to allow it to synchronize, and then you will be able to hopefully pick which factors are key in driving improvement of sustainability for small pelagic fisheries. And then I will go over to the panel. So a moment of silence for you to look at the poll. All right. I hope that that you've all received the poll. You've all been able to fill that out. I'd like to open up the panel. Helena, as representative of the retail industry, I'd like to start with you. You sit at the end of the supply chain. Could you, before we dive into the questions, really shortly say who you are, what you do, and how Tesco relates to small pelagic fisheries, say in 1 minute?
Of course. Thank you, Camille. Great presentation, by the way. First of all, thank you for the opportunity of being here today. Personally, I've used the tuna handbook loads and shared it loads, so this will be super helpful for our work. I am Elena Delgado Nordman, Responsible Sourcing Manager, Marine at Tesco. Tesco is a global retailer, and as one of the biggest retailers in the world, we sell small pelagics, 5-6 species, which represent about 8% of our overall seafood volumes. So that's our direct relationship with them. And then we have that further relationship through aquaculture, and where we sell about, 38% of our overall seafood volumes are fed seafood. So very excited to be in the conversations today on how we can make them more sustainable.
Thank you so much. 38% from aquaculture, and that obviously has a huge marine footprint on the wild capture sector as well. We'll come back to that. Thank you. Over to Lindsay. You are essentially the supplier of Tesco's supplier, if I'm not mistaken. Could you quickly introduce yourself and Cargill?
Sure. I'm Lindsay Pollock. I'm the Sustainability Manager for Cargill Aqua Nutrition in the North Sea part of the business. So working with salmon and trout feed volumes. We have 19 feed mills, and we work in 12 countries. And for our salmonid feed, we make about 1.2 million tons of salmon feed. We are users of marine ingredients and have a high level of interest in sustainably sourcing those marine ingredients, both now and into the future. So that's where our connection is to the small pelagics and our interest in participating in forums such as this.
Thank you. And yeah, I guess that as a feed producer, you really are in the middle, working directly with the fish meal and fish oil producers, and sometimes the fishing companies, and directly working with aquaculture and retail. That's a challenging position to occupy, I imagine, but perhaps help comes in from land. That's coming in from a new and exciting, say, nutritional production complex, algae, that might be used for aquaculture feed. So maybe, Ian, you can elaborate more on yourself and Veramaris.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Camille. And I joined Veramaris because it's a purpose-led innovation that enables that sustainable growth of a vital seafood production system, as you outlined earlier on. So we need to deliver an additional 45 million tons of feed to grow aquaculture, and therefore we need more omega-3. And the innovation that Veramaris has brought to market is the first ASC MSC certified natural marine algal oil. It's the richest source of the two essential fatty acids, EPA and DHA, which are critical in human health for heart health, brain health, and immune health. They're also critical for fish nutrition to ensure the health and welfare of the fish, and therefore the productivity of the aquaculture farms. And they're critical for feed millers too, because whilst they're used to using fish oil as a source of EPA and DHA in their feed, alternative ingredients add resilience whilst ensuring the nutritional safety and the quality of the feed and therefore of the fish. But for Veramaris, it's not just a product. We do business a little differently because we focus on collaborating and inspiring right the way through the value chain to support change in that supply of sustainable seafood. So pleased to be here.
Thank you. And it sounds still a little bit futuristic to me. Algae produced on land that feed fish in the ocean, but it is absolutely a novel ingredient that perhaps can help to relieve pressure on small pelagic fisheries to enable recovery. I would actually like to start with that, and coming back perhaps to you, Helena, on the end of the supply chain. Where do you think the pressure comes from or should come from as a retailer to help to conserve small pelagic fisheries? Is it this sort of innovative raw materials, or is it other things? Is it your buying power?
Thanks. I think that and more have a very big role to play. NGOs, the public, the supply chain, innovative alternative companies. There's a very big mix, and everyone can play a role. From a retailer perspective, we have sourcing policies and supply requirements that also extend to feed, and they're becoming more and more detailed the more we learn about what we need to do and where feed needs to go in the near future. We also have a voice that we use in advocacy towards government especially, and we need to align with the broader market to have a united voice. And a great example of this is the Northeast Atlantic Pelagics Advocacy Group, NAPA. Where a whole bunch of great buyers have come up together to try to improve sustainability through advocacy on the Northeast Atlantic Pelagics. And then in terms of the public voice and consumers, the voice of the public, because there's usually a question that we get from as a retailer, how do we interact with our customers? So in terms of consumers, the voice of the public can be very powerful to support any matter. But as a responsible retailer, we want to ensure that we have a space where consumers can shop freely without worrying if they're doing the right thing when it comes to marine sustainability. And that's why we really focus on our buying power and advocacy powers.
Very clear. Thank you. Yeah, one thing I want to have a bit more clarity, and you mentioned NGOs play a role, but we've seen NGO activity obviously on tuna and on sharks and other iconic species, but on small pelagics, is it also observed that the NGOs hold you as a retailer to account there?
There is a voice, yeah. There's big and smaller NGOs that have already contacted us about this, but overall, especially on feed, there's a lot of focus and growing focus on feed sustainability, and small pelagics play a very key role in that. And also in the increase of using alternatives, which also link into feed sustainability. So I think it's growing in getting broader. Okay,
and then Lindsay, do you recognize it as a major supplier of the suppliers of Tesco? Say, what are your views and the opportunities to incentivize better fisheries management for small pelagics, and what does Cargill do in that respect?
Well, I think, in relation to your question about where, pressure should come from to conserve the pelagic stocks, I think this is, coming from a number of areas. There's clearly a number of stakeholders interested in conservation of pelagic stocks. And I think there's growing consumer awareness about where their food comes from, and what goes into the feed. And I think this is a good opportunity for us actually to tell some of the stories about the care that we take to responsibly and sustainably source the ingredients that we use as a feed supplier, and marine ingredients, of course, being part of that. We take our own position on our sustainable sourcing of marine ingredients policy. We're looking for having all of our marine ingredients certified by 2025, either Marine Trust or MSC. And, we take that seriously. We have assurance through Marine Trust that there's no IUU and also nothing on the IUCN red list. But I think that, we take a position on where we want to source our marine ingredients from. We set the sustainability criteria that we will purchase to, but also we're engaging in fisheries improvement programs as well, so that we can ensure more sustainable marine ingredients can be produced and more sustainable fisheries in general in the years to come. So, as a buyer, we can be part of the picture in terms of incentivizing sustainable behaviour so that more people can have access to sustainably produced seafood.
Great, thank you. I'm trying to follow you. Sometimes the connection is not really good, Lindsay, so forgive me if I didn't hear everything correct, but what I understood is that by 2025, Cargill wants to have all the marine raw materials used in the feeds to be meeting MSC standards or marine trust standards, correct?
Correct, yeah. So we're interested in having them from certified sustainable sources by that point.
Thank you.
And we've made significant progress to date. I'd just like to add on that point. We've got a very high level of certification. I think it's about 90% of the forage material that we're using is certified to at least Marine Trust standard in our salmon.
In cases like say the North Atlantic, there have been media reports on say blue whiting no longer being available for feed production. Is that correct?
Well, as Helena had mentioned about the NAPA group, which is the North Atlantic Pelagic Advocacy Group, blue whiting is an important species for us in terms of the fish meal that we buy. However, we need that to be fished within the scientific advice, and it lost its MSC status at the end of 2020, and we decided not to purchase beyond that date. So, it's important for us to use advocacy here, and we brought others into the group to join the call for that fishery to be brought under sustainable management again, and the coastal nations hopefully will agree to fish within the scientific advice.
Great, and that then is an opportunity potentially for Ian and for Vera Maris, if I'm not mistaken. You produce a novel omega-3, and that can potentially replace, say, products that no longer meet the purchasing criteria of feed producers in terms of sustainability. Do you feel the demand from retailers, farms, and feed producers?
Yeah, we do indeed, Camille. I mean, I'd say it's not exactly novel anymore either. It's really becoming established. We see that 6 out of 10 of the leading salmon farmers in Norway are already specifying algae as a source of omega-3, EPA, and DHA in their feed now, which is just fantastic progress and a sign that the industry is ready for this, these alternative ingredients, and they're ready to specify them into their feed. And part of the reason for that is that they see the pull downstream in their value chain, with players like Tesco being very clear that this is something that they want to see changing, that it's a problem that needs to be solved, and it's something that consumers are voting with their forks for. Is this change? There's this notion of conscious consumers that I really like, and I think you pointed to it in the survey that you highlighted in your report. 6 out of 10 shoppers now select for healthy and sustainable seafood, and 8 out of 10 say that they're willing to do more in that direction. So the pull is there at the end of the chain, and it's flowing all the way back. And I think part of the reason why that's there, Camille, is because of thought leaders. One that's influenced me through my lifetime is David Attenborough, UK naturalist. And I saw his witness statement. I think it was over the Christmas period, where he documents the decline in biodiversity throughout his lifetime, and it's a shocking account of the impact that we, are having on our planet. And if there's one thing that he says we can do differently now to have the maximum impact, it's putting an end to overfishing in our oceans to stem the loss of biodiversity, because that's the first passing of the planetary boundaries, and our innovation enables that to happen. We can make that change happen now. And it's fantastic to see that it is starting to happen at scale.
That's great. I also want to add a question then, because as I said in my presentation, small pelagic fish stocks that are well managed and sustainable, they are an incredible animal protein for human consumption, but also a relatively low impact a marine ingredient in the sense that it can be fished efficiently with low energy input from the fishery that targets shoaling species. So, how do you look at the land-based production of algae? I'm really curious what impacts that has and how you ensure that that is sustainable.
Yes, we ensure that's sustainable by managing the production process that we're investing in, and also the supply chain for the raw materials that we use for our production. And one way in which we've been able to demonstrate the sustainability of that is by securing the ASC MSC certification under the seaweed microalgae standard. We're really proud to be the first microalgae producer for feed that's gained that certification. We got that in January of this year, and overnight, as a result, we added 45% to the supply of MSC certified EPA and DHA. You say in your report there's I think 19% of fisheries, of small pelagic fisheries, are MSC certified. So there's a body of certified EPA and DHA that comes from that. We're adding 45% to that through a certified sustainable, regenerative and renewable resource, which I think is a fantastic recognition, if you like, of what we've been able to achieve.
Thank you. I'm still a bit, curious then, if this is such a fantastic opportunity. Is there a future where essentially aquaculture fish would be fed perhaps completely on fish-free diets? Is that a future? Is that realistic? Maybe I'm asking that to Lindsay as a feed producer in first instance, and also moving over to Helena on that too, because ultimately, what does the market expect on this? But maybe first, Lindsay.
Yeah. Well, I think I'd like to just, start with a point. As a sustainability manager, it's good for us to work with a wide basket of sustainable raw materials, of which marine ingredients are, one component of. And, we would like to continue to use them in the future, providing that they can be sustainably sourced. We've made significant amounts of replacement, around about 80% reduction, I think, since the 2000s in terms of the marine content in diets. And the reason we've been able to do that is because the salmon have got a requirement for nutrients that need to be met for their own physiological process and health and welfare, rather than ingredients. So there's, we definitely see alternative ingredients coming into the basket, but I think it's important that we play with as many possible ingredients as we can, so that we have resilience in the basket and in the supply chain. It's we can do things to use more byproducts, for example, which is another big story of the feed industry over the last few years. In salmon diets, we're probably running around about 35%. As a group, probably about 40% of the marine ingredients we're using are now coming from byproducts. So we see that as being a potentially underutilized resource that we would like to encourage more byproducts through the system as well. There are some roles that, for example, fish meals and fish oils do play in the diet. They're important contributors both of protein, but also amino acids, for example, and other micronutrients, and as well as the EPA DHA that Ian talks about. And we are seeing an increase in algal source EPA DHA coming into the basket. We've been doing that recently through our production in Norway. We're also introducing insect meal in the feed. We've been doing that as well. So these things are there, but they need to be valued across the value chain, to turn these things from novel into mainstream. And this is really at the heart of how these things can be scaled up and adopted. But it's, from my point of view, I think it's important that we try and move away from having perhaps just single focuses on certain ingredients to managing the complexity of having a wider choice. And as a sustainability manager, that's what I have to look at, having a number of balls in play.
And Helena, if I go to you, that reliance on say wild capture, say forage fish, you wanted to actually reduce. I saw on your website that you want the forage fish dependency ratio to become lower than 1. And how does that become a reality in Tesco?
So there's a few things to kind of cover here. So first of all, from our perspective and looking at farm fish overall, we have some species that of course aren't fed, some species that are vegetarian fed already, and then in terms of the more carnivorous species like salmon, we've seen in the research and the scope that we've done that there's a significant reduction in fish in the diet. I think it's down to 10%, has been shown to not affect the performance of the fish health. And with aquaculture absorbing the increased global demand of seafood, there is a need to reduce this dependency on forage fish and the ones that we're using, making sure that it's sustainable, like Linz was saying. But we always have to have in mind the welfare of the fish when reducing or anything else, welfare of the fish, and also the health benefits of the final product for the consumer health. So you're correct. We have now, as part of the Sustainable Basket metrics in our partnership with WWF, we have a target of achieving FFDR below 1 by 2030. And we're focusing first on salmon, and we are a part of how to making this a reality. Like your question is, we see a significant increase on alternatives such as the algal oil. And what I keep saying in trying to share the message is we do need an aligned vision from the global industry on where we're trying to get to and what our goals are. So the more that we have a common goal, the more we'll be able to collaborate together and make it a reality, and sooner. It's very encouraging to see suppliers to us like Cargill to make it step forward with any of these alternatives. And I think we're starting. I see a bright future, but a lot of work to happen before we get there, really.
And that sort of that call for a collaboration and sort of an industry uniting around a certain direction. I mentioned that the ASC feed standard has now, after many rounds of consultations with experts from the feed industry and other stakeholder groups, been completed. Is that essentially the blueprint for the global direction on this, Lindsay?
Well, I think, good news that the feed standard is signed off and will be out. This is clearly something applicable to us. We're seeing a growing amount of volume in Norway in particular adopting ASC certification on the farms. I think it's clear that certified and sustainable marine ingredients are still a feature of that standard, and there's also encouragement to move up the ladder to the highest level of MSC certification. But I think the standards are useful. They're a simple way to communicate sustainability right through the value chain, for example. So I see that as being a positive thing, and I'm certain most people can align around what these standards are trying to achieve in terms of their sustainability objectives.
And Ian, I'm not so familiar with the ASC feed standard. I've in the beginning been able to see a couple of drafts, but have you been involved in the development, and are say algae oils recognized as part of that solution too?
Yeah, for sure. They could, algal oil could be part of the solution, especially when it's certified itself, by the same body. That's all lined up, all the ducks are in row. But I'm looking forward to seeing the final standard of the ASC feed standard. I've seen drafts, but I haven't seen the final one that was ratified last week. And what I've heard from the stakeholders is that there is some disconnect between the requirement for MSC certified ingredients in the salmon standard and yet in the feed standard, it's like a cascade of continuous improvement. And I have to say, with certification standards, I think sometimes the focus on continuous improvement is not enough. You need to be bold and set out the objectives. It's not enough in some ways to set long-term objectives. You have to have milestones to make change happen faster. Because we're facing challenges now. Biodiversity is declining at a faster rate than ever. Climate change is happening at a faster rate than ever. We've got to make change happen to tackle these problems, and that requires certification standards to step up and be bold in the targets that they set and the way in which they describe what good practice looks like. And we see some evidence of that. I think the new Global Gap compound feed standard for the first time has a control point on novel feed ingredients, which is fantastic. It's a step in the right direction. I want to see that connect to the standards that they set for certification of marine ingredients and also terrestrial ingredients, because the two are linked. We also see with the GAA's best aquaculture practices the introduction of this Vanguard system, where they recognise stakeholders that go above and beyond the standard. Because what's possible now is completely different to what was possible a couple of years ago. When some of these standards were set, and therefore stakeholders that go above and beyond those standards and contribute to moving the industry in the right direction should be recognised for that.
So you raise a couple of important points that standards, they should continue to evolve and make sure that they are aligned with best practice. And another thing you said, that it needs to go from aspirations to performance, essentially. Helena, how do you look at that? What role does certification play, and would the ASC feed standard become relevant for Tesco as well?
So the standards are play a very big role on what we do. In terms of our farm seafood, 99.9% of our volumes are certified to a GSSI recognized standard, and that's publicly available through the Ocean Disclosure Project, as well as all wild seafood. But we're seeing that even with long-term certified fisheries, and even when you talk about forests, long-term certified forests, we're still finding environmental challenges and those forests being at risk. So there is a need to move towards the more ecosystem and holistic approach, ecosystem-based approach. That's what we're trying to apply on our tuna sourcing, for example, now. So that concept kind of brings into mind that certification is part of the journey, an essential part of the journey that drives change and is a key milestone. But sometimes we do need to go and look ahead and have that even longer term vision as well.
Great. I'm actually conscious of time, and I think that we have started to see some audience questions come in. I'm actually going to check that on my system here. I have a system with which I work to moderate the panel. And one question I received is on Mesopelagic fisheries, which is are Mesopelagic fisheries, so just for clarity, that are fisheries targeting stocks that live between 200 and 1100 meters depth in the oceans. Are those a serious option? And if so, could they be sustainably managed? I have my own views on that, but I'd like to first give this to the panel. Who would like to go first on that? Maybe Lindsay, what is your view on that? Mesopelagic fisheries, are they potentially a relevant source for meal and oil?
I think it's an interesting area, and still something that's up for exploration at the moment. And I think for us, going in to look at another option of let's say an underutilized marine resource, we would very much have to be conscious that could be fished sustainably and be guided by the science in that respect. But yes, it is on our radar, and it is something that we have an interest in looking at.
And Helena, would that be a potential acceptable source for Tesco as ingredient in feed?
This is a very interesting question. I've been looking into it. I'm very wary. I don't think it's the golden ticket to solve sustainability on feed at all. I do think that, like Lindsay said, we need to focus on science and understand what that's saying. Very wary that there less data and less knowledge on these fisheries. So we have to be very careful on how we manage that resource.
And very little is known on many of these stocks sitting in deeper waters, and it's also expensive, I presume, to target those. So could that compete with other marine raw materials, for instance, algae, if it goes to scale? Ian, what's your view?
I think we have to be really careful, and ask ourselves the question: is that the right direction for us to go in? Do we understand fully the ecosystem impacts of starting to intervene at those mesopelagic levels? We already have got ourselves into a bit of a pickle with the fisheries that we're exploiting already. So do we really want to go down that road, or do we want to go down a road where we take back control of our raw materials and produce them under controlled circumstances, where we can reduce the variability as well of the raw materials? We can ensure the traceability of the raw materials. We can manage any environmental impacts. We can measure and manage any environmental impacts that we do have. So for me, that's the more sustainable and smarter way forward. And when it comes to cost, we've got to make sure that we factor in the true cost for the different raw materials, and effectively price in the environmental cost of commodities as we talk about them. Because many in the procurement side of our business are trained to value commodities and alternatives in the same way as they have done for years, and yet we need to solve some big problems like biodiversity and climate change. So it takes a new way of thinking, and we've got to factor in those environmental costs into the true cost of the raw materials that we're procuring.
Great, thank you. Another question related to what I perhaps said on NGOs. It says the NGO interest in sustainability of small pelagics is less than on other seafood. Is this a help or a hindrance? Who wants to respond? Maybe at the end of the supply chain. Helena, could we start with you?
Yeah, to be honest, this is like on top of our list. So we have been discussing with several different NGOs about it. So I haven't really seen, there's no public campaigns maybe that big about it, but we haven't really seen that lack of support or engagement from them really.
But has there been the same level of attention for small pelagics compared to, say, tuna, or is it clearly something that NGOs can perhaps pay more attention to and say, hey, in our ratings, we need to be as scrutinizing on small pelagics as we are to, for instance, tuna fisheries, in the case that harvest strategies and harvest control rules still need to be developed to assure long-term sustainability?
There's always room for more, but like I said, I honestly think that we've been, WWF has been very involved, for example, SFP has been involved. I've seen support, maybe there's a bit more that we can do, but there's also been quite a lot of, I'm thinking of the Northeast Atlantic work that we've been doing with NAPA in the advocacy towards those coastal states. I think it's been there, maybe we can grow it more for sure. It can be more top line, I guess.
Great. I have a question, which it's a more technical question, I guess, but it links to something that I've heard about, the ecosystem approach. It says, what additional safeguards are needed to reflect these species' unique role in the ecosystem? Who wants to respond to that?
I think you're in a good place to respond to that, Camille.
That's fair enough. So yeah, I get the ball from the panel. That's okay. I actually did present on that, I guess, as well, and maybe that triggered the question. But yeah, small pelagics are very often very important for the ecosystem. In many cases, they play a key role transferring energy up from lower levels in the food chain, phytoplankton, zooplankton, to the predatory species. They often have a lot of connections in the ecosystem. And in cases where there's very few alternative species in that niche that they occupy, you need to be very, very careful. So an ecosystem approach, I think, is very much embedded in the MSC standards for all fisheries, but specifically for key low trophic level species, that there is extra precaution in that standard that ensures that more biomass remains in the water for those stocks that depend on it. Another question, I think, related to the Northeast Atlantic. So, dear panel, how can you influence fisheries managers, governments, and RFMOs to ensure that they take account of climate change in their management of small pelagics, as well as how do you task them and force them to agree amongst themselves to share these stocks before they crash? Gosh, there's a lot wrapped up in that, but I guess the key question is how do you influence fisheries managers and RFMOs? Helena, you referred to NAPA. Maybe that's something to elaborate on a bit.
Yes, I'm happy to take that on. So basically, I encourage everyone to take a look at the 5-year plan of NAPA, because that answer is super complicated. It's very hard to drive that change within government. I think that we're doing as a market a very good job in the past few years. We've bringing the market voice into the table of the decision makers, and we've been doing that in tuna with the GTA, and NAPA's doing that on pelagics, on small pelagics, and we're creating those channels of communication, and maybe they weren't that open before, and we're having more frequent conversations and understanding on how we can make these changes happen with the government. But more details are specified on that 5-year plan that kind of covers how we're planning on trying to drive that change.
And Lindsay, you're part of that as well. Is 5 years? Is that?
Sorry, I said 5. Yeah, I think it might be 3, the one that we've specified. Sorry.
So, we're obviously interested in this with our position on the blue whiting fishery and looking for a resolution where the coastal states can agree to fish within the scientific advice collectively. I think so far, we've stepped out of that position, and we would have to see significant progress being made against a FIP. The fisheries had MSC and lost it. Just because it's entered a FIP doesn't necessarily mean that automatically triggers us to start buying material again until we've seen that the progress has been significant. So it's, from our perspective, to be part of this group that's advocating for a more sustainable management system to be in place there is important. And, obviously, we're using our position as buyers to try and have some kind of influence on that, to have a more sustainable outcome.
Okay, and I'm going to actually very soon wrap up. I still will do one additional question, and then I think offer you all last thoughts before going to summarize and wrap up. But quickly then, the last question is there. It says, if you aim for a fish feed dependency ratio below 1, could there be unintended consequences? I think that is targeted perhaps at you, Helena, but we welcome any panelists to respond to that.
Yes. So one of the things that comes up on all the engagement that we've done is those alternative ingredients and the footprint that they come with. And of course, when we include these, they will come with the appropriate LCAs to understand that the overall picture and the overall footprint of the feed. So definitely something that we have in mind, and we'll make sure that we mitigate any risk.
Lindsay, any thoughts on that?
Yes,
consequences of aiming for an almost fish-free diet.
Yeah, I think this is an important point. By focusing on one issue, do you create consequences somewhere else? By pivoting to a different ingredient, and that's where the FFDR metric is one thing, looking at forage fish dependency, and that's not to say that marine ingredients cannot be sourced sustainably. The question is about future availability of enough sustainably sourced marine ingredients. We also have to look at what else could be in the basket, and their sustainability credentials in their own right. So we have to look at every ingredient and judge it on its own merits. As Helena's just mentioned, increasingly we're looking at life cycle assessment to look at the environmental impact over a range of impact categories. And, you know, for us, carbon footprint is, you know, clearly a very significant focus for us. So, you know, we want to look at that. We know that marine ingredients at the moment have a lower carbon footprint than some of the vegetable ingredients, for example, that are in the basket, but we have to find ways to manage these and move forward. So you may have seen in the media that our new Sea Further Sustainability Initiative has been launched, and the overarching goal of that is to reduce the carbon footprint of salmon by 30% by 2030. So very much supporting the value chain to try and drive towards achieving science-based targets. You know, I think in short, we have to take, you know, the forage fish dependency ratio as one metric that we have to have in our consciousness on every decision that we make around about feed sustainability. Go ahead, Helena.
Very clear. Thank you. And we're really moving into the last minutes of the webinar. So I'd like to go over to maybe any last thoughts. Ian, maybe you want to start off if you make any last comments on driving small pelagic fishery sustainability. What would you do?
I think it starts with collaboration right the way through the value chain, Camille. You know, there are some great examples of that. It needs to happen more and it needs to happen faster. And we're for sure doing our part of Virimaris to engage with stakeholders right the way through the value chain to help them to make change happen faster. I think we have to recognize now that we've changed the paradigm of what's possible. You know, we can do things now in terms of feeding farmed fish, you know, in a more sustainable way, ensuring the safety of the product that's being produced, ensuring the nutritional quality of the product that's being produced, all while at the same time as looking after the sustainability of the food system. And therefore, we have a moral obligation, really, to embrace that change and make it happen, because CEOs will be held accountable, you know, by their stakeholders, by their shareholders. They're more and more having to recognise the environmental, social governance that's required for them to unlock capital, so they'll be held accountable for making this change happen and adapting to the new reality.
Thank you. Lindsay, any last thoughts? Please be quick. We're running out of time.
I think you know, it's key for us to continue to engage on the issues here and engage with you know, a range of stakeholders, and I think that's going to be the way going forward for us. So yeah, we are open to engagement with a number of people across the value chain to make this happen and make feed more sustainable.
And Helena, final word to you to wrap up.
Super quickly, I wanted to leave the audience with a bit of a thought. So we need to think smartly about how we can increase the demand for sustainable credentials on the whole supply chain overall, and how we can use their leverage. So something that I had in mind to leave the audience with this question to think about was unexpected partnership, and an example can be with telecoms companies or modern style documentary showings, which I think has had an impact in the UK. So maybe that can go more into other areas of the world or increase that demand.
Great. I'm going to wrap up as well, and maybe this is also the moment to look at the poll results. I think that those will come up on screen, and I can use them also to sort of make my final conclusions. I'm going to wrap up, and I'm going to say that the impact of the feed industry and the aquaculture industry on small pelagic fisheries is absolutely clear. There's a lot of very good initiatives happening, from retailers to feed producers to the producers of the raw materials into feed to drive sustainability forward. Standards have a key role to play to drive that improvement, and we all are agreeing that an aquaculture that is going to grow, that is going to produce sustainable food for more people as the world population is increasing is going to potentially relieve the pressure on wild capture fisheries. But for that, these wild capture fisheries need to be properly managed. And collaborative efforts is absolutely critical to install proper management, long-term management plans, harvest strategies, and harvest control rules for pelagics and for other species. On that note, I want to close off. Anyone that hasn't had its questions answered, by all means, you will get a response from us. You will also get the small pelagic briefing sent to you, and if not, you can download it or ask your local team. I want to thank you very much for your participation. A big thank you to the panelists as well, and I would like to say goodbye.